murder, deportation for slave labor and for other purposes of civilian populations of occupied territories, murder and ill treatment of prisoners of war and of persons on the high seas, the taking and killing of hostages, the plunder of public and private property, the wanton destruction of cities, towns, and villages, and devastation not justified by military necessity. The common plan or conspiracy contemplated and came to embrace as typical and systematic mean, and the defendants determined upon and committed, crimes against humanity, both within Germany and within occupied territories, including murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against civilian populations before and during the war, and persecution on political, racial, or religious grounds in execution of the plan for preparing and prosecuting aggressive or illegal wars. Many of such acts and persecutions being violations of the domestic laws of the countries where perpetrated. Particulars of the nature and development of the common plan or conspiracy. A, the Nazi Party as the central core of the common plan or conspiracy. In 1921, Adolf Hitler became the supreme leader of Führer of the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party, which had been founded in Germany in 1920. He continued as such throughout the period covered by this indictment. The Nazi Party, together with certain of its subsidiary organizations, became the instrument of cohesion among the defendants and their co-conspirators, and an instrument for the carrying out of the aims and purposes of their conspiracy. Each defendant became a member of the Nazi Party and of the conspiracy with knowledge of their aims and purposes, or with such knowledge became an accessory to their aims and purposes at some stage of the development of the conspiracy. B, common objectives and methods of conspiracy. The aims and purposes of the Nazi Party and of the defendants and divers other persons from time to time associated as leaders, members, supporters, or adherents of the Nazi Party, hereinafter called collectively the Nazi conspirators, were or came to be to accomplish the following by any means deemed opportune, including unlawful means, and contemplating ultimate resort to threat of force, and aggressive war. First, to abrogate and overthrow the Treaty of Versailles and its restrictions upon the military armament and activity of Germany. To acquire the territories lost by Germany as the result of the World War of 1914-1918 and other territories in Europe asserted by the Nazi conspirators to be occupied principally by so-called racial Germans. Third, to acquire still further territories in continental Europe and elsewhere claimed by the Nazi conspirators to be required by the racial Germans as Lebensraum, or living space, all at the expense of neighboring and other countries. The aims and purposes of the Nazi conspirators were not fixed or static, but evolved and expanded as they acquired progressively greater power and became able to make more effective application of threats of force and threats of aggressive war. When their expanding aims and purposes became finally so great as to provoke such strength of resistance as could be overthrown only by armed force and aggressive war, and not simply by the opportunistic methods theretofore used, such as fraud, deceit, threats, intimidation, fifth column activities, and propaganda. The Nazi conspirators deliberately planned, determined upon, and launched their aggressive wars and wars in violation of international treaties, agreements, and assurances by the phases and steps hereinafter more particularly described. C. Doctrinal techniques of the common plan or conspiracy. To incite others to join in the common plan or conspiracy, and as a means of securing for the Nazi conspirators their highest degree of control over the German community. Fourth, disseminated and exploited certain doctrine, among others, as follows. 1. That persons of so-called German blood, as specified by the Nazi conspirators, were a master race and were accordingly entitled to subjugate, dominate, or exterminate other races and peoples. 2. That the German people should be ruled under the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, according to which power was to reside in a Führer from whom sub-leaders were to derive authority in a hierarchical order, each sub-leader to owe unconditional obedience to his immediate superior, but to be absolute in his own sphere of jurisdiction. And the power of the leadership was to be unlimited, extending to all phases of public and private life. 3, that war was a noble and necessary activity of Germany. That the leadership of the Nazi Party, as the sole bearer of the foregoing and other doctrine of the Nazi Party, was entitled to shape the structure, policies, and practices of the German state and all related institutions, to direct and supervise the activities of all individuals within the state, and to destroy all opponents. D, the acquiring of totalitarian control of Germany, political. 1, first steps in the acquisition of control of state machinery. In order to accomplish their aims and purposes, the Nazi conspirators prepared to seize totalitarian control over Germany to assure that no effective resistance against them could arise within Germany itself. After the failure of the Munich Putsch of 1923, aimed at the overthrow of the Weimar Republic by direct action, the Nazi conspirators set out through the Nazi Party to undermine and capture the German government by legal forms supported by terrorism. They created and utilized as a party formation the Sturmabteilungen, SA, a semi-military voluntary organization of young men trained for and committed to the use of violence, whose mission was to make the party the master of the streets. Second, control acquired. On 30th January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of the German Republic. After the Reichstag fire of 28 February 1933, clauses of the Weimar Constitution guaranteeing personal liberty, freedom of speech, of the press, of association and assembly were suspended. The Nazi conspirators secured the passage by the Reichstag of a law for the protection of the people and the right, giving Hitler and the members of his then cabinet plenary powers of legislation. The Nazi conspirators retained such powers after having changed the members of the cabinet. The conspirators caused all political parties, except the Nazi Party, to be prohibited. They caused the Nazi Party to be established as a para-governmental organization with extensive and extraordinary privileges. 3, consolidation of control. Thus possessed of the machinery of the German state, the Nazi conspirators set about the consolidation of their position of power within Germany, the extermination of potential internal resistance, and the placing of the German nation on a military footing. Nazi conspirators reduced the Reichstag to a body of their own nominees and curtailed the freedom of popular elections throughout the country. They transformed the several states, provinces, and municipalities, which had formerly exercised semi-autonomous powers, into hardly more than administrative organs of the central government. They united the offices of the president and the chancellor in the person of Hitler, instituted a widespread purge of civil servants, and severely restricted the independence of the judiciary and rendered it subservient to Nazi ends. The conspirators greatly enlarged existing state and party organizations, established a network of new state and party organizations, and coordinated state agencies with the Nazi Party and its branches and affiliates, with the result that German life was dominated by Nazi doctrine and practice and progressively mobilized for the accomplishment of their aim. In order to make their rule secure from attack and to instill fear in the hearts of the German people, the Nazi conspirators established and extended a system of terror against opponents and supposed or suspected opponents of the regime. They imprisoned such persons without judicial process, holding them in protective custody and concentration camps, and subjected them to persecution, degradation, despoilment, enslavement, torture, and murder. These concentration camps were established early in 1933 under the direction of the defendant Goering and expanded as a fixed part of the terroristic policy and methods of the conspirators and used by them for the commission of the crimes against humanity hereinafter alleged. Among the principal agencies utilized in the perpetration of these crimes were the SS and the Gestapo, together with other favored branches or agencies of the state and party, were permitted to operate without restraint of law. The Nazi conspirators conceived that, in addition to the suppression of distinctively political opposition, it was necessary to suppress or exterminate certain other movements or groups, which they regarded as obstacles to the retention of total control in Germany and to the aggressive aims of the conspiracy abroad. Accordingly, first, the Nazi conspirators destroyed the free trade unions in Germany by confiscating their funds and properties, persecuting their leaders, prohibiting their activities, and supplanting them by an affiliated party organization. The leadership principle was introduced into industrial relations, the entrepreneur becoming the leader and the workers becoming his followers. Thus, any potential resistance of the workers was frustrated, and the productive labor capacity of the German nation was brought under the effective control of the conspirators. Second, the Nazi conspirators, by promoting beliefs and practices incompatible with Christian teaching, sought to subvert the influence of the churches over the people, and in particular over the youth of Germany. They avowed their aim to eliminate the Christian churches in Germany and sought to substitute, therefore, Nazi institutions and Nazi beliefs, and pursued a program of persecution of priests, clergy, and members of monastic orders whom they deemed opposed to their purposes, and confiscated church property. Third, the persecution by the Nazi conspirators of pacifist groups, including religious movements dedicated to pacifism, was particularly relentless and cruel. Implementing their master race policy, the conspirators joined in a program of relentless persecution of the Jews, designed to exterminate them. Annihilation of the Jews became an official state policy, carried out both by official action and by incitements to mob and individual violence. The conspirators openly avowed their purpose. For example, the defendant Rosenberg stated, I quote, "Anti-Semitism is the unifying element of the reconstruction of Germany." On another occasion, he also stated, "Germany will regard the Jewish question as solved only after the very last Jew has left the greater German living space. Europe will have its Jewish question solved only after the very last Jew has left the continent." The defendant lied, declared, "We swear we are not going to abandon the struggle until the last Jew in Europe has been exterminated," and is actually dead. It is not enough to isolate the Jewish enemy of mankind. The Jew has got to be exterminated. On another occasion, he also declared, "The second German secret weapon is anti-Semitism, because if it is consistently pursued by Germany, it will become a universal problem which all nations will be forced to consider." The defendant Strache declared, "The sun will not shine on the nations of the earth until the last Jew is dead." These avowals and incitements were typical of the declarations of the Nazi conspirators throughout the course of their conspiracy. The program of action against the Jews included disfranchisement, stigmatization, denial of civil liberties, subjecting their persons and property to violence, deportation, enslavement, enforced labor, starvation, murder, and mass extermination. The extent to which the conspirators succeeded in their purpose can only be estimated. But the annihilation was substantially complete in many localities of Europe. Of the 9,600,000 Jews who lived in the parts of Europe under Nazi domination, it is conservatively estimated that 5,700,000 have disappeared. Most of them deliberately put to death by the Nazi conspirators. Remnants of the Jewish population of Europe remain. In order to make the German people amenable to their will and to prepare them psychologically for war, the Nazi conspirators reshaped the educational system, and particularly the education and training of the German youth. The leadership principle was introduced into the schools, and the party and affiliated organizations were given wide supervisory powers over education. The Nazi conspirators imposed a supervision of all cultural activities, controlled the dissemination of information and the expression of opinion within Germany, as well as the movement of intelligence of all kinds from and into Germany, and created a vast propaganda machine. The Nazi conspirators placed a considerable number of their dominated organizations on a progressively militarized footing with a view to rapid transformation and use of such organizations whenever necessary as instruments of war. The acquiring of totalitarian control in Germany, economic, and the economic planning and mobilization for aggressive war. Having gained political power, the conspirators organized Germany's economy to give effect to their political aim. First, in order to eliminate the possibility of resistance in the economic sphere, they deprived labor of its rights of free industrial and political association, as particularized in paragraph D3C1 herein. They used organizations of German business as instruments of economic mobilization for war. 3. They directed Germany's economy towards preparation and equipment of the military machine. To this end, they directed finance, capital investment, and foreign trade. For the Nazi conspirators, and in particular the industrialists among them, embarked upon a huge rearmament program and set out to produce and develop huge quantities of materials of war and to create a powerful military operation. 5. With the object of carrying through the preparation for war, the Nazi conspirators set up a series of administrative agencies and authorities. For example, in 1936, they established for this purpose the office of the 4-year plan, with Defendant Goering as plenipotentiary, vesting it with overriding control over Germany's economy. On 28 August 1939, immediately before launching their aggression against Poland, they appointed the Defendant Funk plenipotentiary for economics. On 30 August 1939, they set up the Ministerial Council for the Defense of the Reich to act as a war cabinet. Utilization of Nazi control for foreign aggression. First, the status of the conspiracy by the middle of 1933 and projected plan. By the middle of the year 1933, the Nazi conspirators, having acquired governmental control over Germany, were in a position to enter upon further and more detailed planning with particular relationship to foreign policy. Their plan was to rearm and to reoccupy and fortify the Rhineland in violation of the Treaty of Versailles and other treaties, in order to acquire military strength and political bargaining power to be used against other nations. The Nazi conspirators decided that for that purpose the Treaty of Versailles must definitely be abrogated, and specific plans were made by them and put into operation by 7 March 1936, all of which opened the way for the major aggressive steps to follow, as hereinafter set forth. In the execution of this phase of the conspiracy, the Nazi conspirators did the following acts. They led Germany to enter upon a course of secret rearmament from 1933 to March 1935, including the training of military personnel and the production of munitions of war and the building of an air force. B. On 14 October 1933, they led Germany to leave the International Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations. C. On 10 March 1935, the defendant Goering announced that Germany was building a military air force. On 16 March 1935, the Nazi conspirators promulgated a law for universal military service in which they stated the peacetime strength of the German army would be fixed at 500,000 men. On 21 May 1935, they falsely announced to the world, with intent to deceive and allay fears of aggressive intentions, that they would respect the territorial limitation of the Versailles Treaty and comply with the Locarno Pact. On 7 March 1936, they reoccupied and fortified the Rhineland in violation of the Treaty of Versailles and the Rhine Pact of Locarno of 16 October 1925, and falsely announced to the world that we have no territorial demands to make in Europe. Then, aggressive action against Austria and Czechoslovakia. The 1936-38 phase of the planning for the assault on Austria and Czechoslovakia. The Nazi conspirators next entered upon the specific planning for the acquisition of Austria and Czechoslovakia, realizing it would be necessary for military reasons first to seize Austria before assaulting Czechoslovakia. On 21 May 1935, in a speech to the Reichstag, Hitler stated that Germany neither intends nor wishes to interfere in the internal affairs of Austria, to annex Austria, or to conclude an Anschluss. On 1 May 1936, within 2 months after the reoccupation of the Rhineland, Hitler stated, "The lie goes forth again that Germany tomorrow, or the day after, will fall upon Austria or Czechoslovakia." Thereafter, the Nazi conspirators caused a treaty to be entered into between Austria and Germany on 11 July 1936, Article 1 of which stated that the German government recognizes the full sovereignty of the Federated State of Austria in the spirit of the pronouncements of the German Führer and Chancellor of 21 May 1935. Meanwhile, plans for aggression in violation of that treaty were being made. By the autumn of 1936-37, all noteworthy opposition within the Reich had been crushed.